Hey TechKnowStuds! In this lesson, we're going to go over the basics around risk management, what it is, some terms around risk management, and some other concepts that we're going to need to know that's going to create a basis for the rest of this module. So let's jump into risk management. We're going to kick this module off going over some definitions and terms around risk management. Then we're going to get into the functions and scope around risk management. What does it all cover? Then we'll talk about the risk management versus vulnerability management because there could be some confusion around those two different terms. And then we'll talk about usability versus security requirements. When we talk about a security program or a risk management program, we're really mitigating against risk in both cases. Well, what type of risk do we have? Well, the CIA triad gives us some element of what we're talking about from a risk perspective. If we have the CIA, the C stands for confidentiality, the I stands for integrity, and the A stands for availability. This is what we're trying to incorporate into the infrastructures that we're managing. And so from this perspective, we could have a lack of confidentiality or a lack of integrity or a lack of availability is really what we're guarding against. Now, I love the CIA triad, but risk management goes beyond just the CIA triad. When it comes to the CIA triad, we're really talking about technology. We're really talking about our services that we're offering. We're talking about the data that we're storing and making sure that those remain confidential and the integrity involved in it and the availability. But there are other risks to the business that risk management addresses. We're going to get more into that with the scope when we talk about the scope of risk management. To a large degree, risk management is protecting assets. We have some sort of asset. In this case right here, maybe it's data. And so risk management is all about protecting that data, protecting us against the risk to that data. So those assets have some sort of threat to them. Threat is something that could happen to that data. Well, in this case, data could be stolen. It could be altered or it could be deleted. From a CIA triad standpoint, stolen has to deal with confidentiality. If it's stolen, somebody has the right to view that or has access to view that information, and that could be bad and devastating. Or it could be altered, which attacks the integrity of it, or it could be deleted, which attacks the availability. And there are other things that can happen to this as well. Maybe it's not deleted, but maybe it's just offline for a while. Well, that would be attacking availability as well. But the point here is that there is some sort of threats to this data. Then we have a threat agent or actor. And this is just like an entity or an organization, or maybe it's a single person or whoever's carrying out the attack. So they are doing the ones who are stealing or altering or deleting. And that's the threat agent or threat actor. Risk is actually an equation, and it's a function of the probability, what's the likelihood that something's going to happen, times the impact. What will be the impact be if it does happen? For instance, let's say this threat agent were to steal this asset. What's the impact that that's going to have? And what is the probability that it's going to have? Maybe we're not so secure in holding this asset, so the probability is pretty high, but maybe the impact to this is maybe low. Maybe it's just some data that doesn't really matter all that much. And so that was going to play into what is the risk of this happening. Or if the probability is high and the impact is high, then our risk suddenly goes up with that. Mitigation is putting steps into place that is going to help mitigate that threat. So in this case right here, we have put up a wall and a gate to access this data. So what essentially this does, if we're mitigating, we're lessening the risk. And the way we lessen the risk is either lessen the probability that this is going to have or lessen the impact if it does happen. So in this case, stealing, what we've done is we put a wall in place, reducing the probability that this is going to be or probability that this will happen. So therefore reducing the risk. To reduce the impact, maybe we delete some of the data that we no longer longer need. And so that deletes the impact this has. So that reduces the risk as well. A vulnerability is when there's some sort of weakness in the system. Maybe in this case right here, we have a break in the gate, or maybe the lock of this gate is not very good. And so we maybe have some sort of vulnerability here. Exploitation is when the threat actor or agent was going to use that vulnerability and leverage it to try to get access or try to use it for whatever purpose that they're trying to use it for. So in this case right here, we've got a break in the gate, and this threat actor is going to exploit that or use that to their advantage. If the threat actor is successful, now we have a breach. Maybe they've stolen this data, so they have successfully broken into our network, that's the breach part of this, and carried out that threat. Risk management is the processes and things that we use to manage the risk. We've already mentioned what we want to do is we want to mitigate the risk. We want to reduce the risk. So the risk management process helps identify what the risk is and reduce that risk. And so really, we're reducing the probability and impact. And we're doing that by implementing controls. Now, there are different definitions of what a control is, but in this case right here, we're going to use control as putting steps in place to mitigate risk. So in the example that I'm giving right here is the gate that I'm putting up here and the wall that I'm putting up there is a control that we're putting into place to mitigate this risk or reduce the risk by reducing the amount of probability here. If I put another control in place which says we're going to delete data we're no longer using, then we're reducing the impact. That's another control I put into place to reduce the risk. Now there is security operations, which is all about risk management. So these are the different operations that we want to carry out as part of a security operations. We want to go into compliance management. We want to do asset acquisition and management. We want to do vulnerability and patch management. We want to do vendor and supply chain management. All of these really is all about risk management. So what's different about this risk management? What are we talking about here? We have all of these other things that we're doing as part of our security operations that could be categorized as risk management. So what's happening here? Well, I like to think of it as two different subroutines. Number one is even when we're doing, let's say like vendor management, we're managing different vendors. Well, we have to have a common way that we're going to measure risk across all of these different functions. And so the first subroutine is creating that measurement. So part of risk management is creating a measurement in which we're going to gauge risk by. The second thing here is a risk assessment, that we're going to be performing risk assessments on our network, and maybe even a full-on risk assessment once a year, and then ongoing risk assessment throughout the year. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at these two different subroutines of measuring risk and doing risk assessment as part of this risk management. Another thing that's a little bit different about risk management is the scope of operations. That means when we're talking about these other different functions as part of our security operations. For instance, let's say we're evaluating assets. Usually we're digging down into our technical assets and some of our other assets that we have for the company. And a lot of times they have to deal with cybersecurity and information security and data security and network security. We're not going to get into the definitions of all of that. But essentially, when we're talking about risk management, we take a broader scope. We're looking at all risk for all of the company and the organization, not just in these specific areas. So let's look at an example of this. Let's say we are number one in our industry. Maybe we're cranking out widgets and we're doing it in an excellent way and sales are booming and we're number one in the industry. Well, one of the risks that we have is somebody could come by and develop widgets in a much better way, or maybe the widget itself changes and it's much more marketable. And so something has happened where we now get dislodged from number one and maybe we now drop to number three. Well, that's a risk to the business. And a lot of our other security operations that we do might not even catch that as being a risk. So what risk management does is it takes takes this big overall scoping thing. This is our organization. What is everything that can happen to our organization that puts it at risk? And in this example right here, one thing that could happen is that we could have a competitor that comes out with a better product or can develop it faster or can develop it with better quality or could somehow develop these widgets that outperforms us, and then we become irrelevant in our industry. And the scope can really be seen when we're talking about things like risk management versus vulnerability management. And these two terms can seem like they overlap quite a bit. In fact, they do overlap quite a bit. They're definitely closely related. In fact, vulnerability management in 800-53, NIST 800-53, a set of controls, a framework for setting up your cybersecurity operations, really groups these both under risk management. And I like to think of them as two separate operations here, because really in my experience, they are set apart from each other. And when it comes to risk management, we're looking at the overall risk to the company, whereas vulnerability management, we're looking at weaknesses in technology. Really, it has to do with risk to the business or organization versus the technology we use and what are the different weaknesses of those different technologies, which is certainly a risk to the business. So that's one reason why a lot of times it's seen as a subset of risk management. Let's also address the usability of these systems versus security requirements of those systems, because there is a balance between those. That is, the most secure I could make, let's say, a network is I could go and unplug it from the internet and just unplug everything. And so now you don't have any connectivity. Well, that is being super secure. It is really taking very little chance and really removing all of the risk or almost all of the risk from something being compromised. But the usability is going to be really poor. We have those systems in place. We have that data in place. We have those things in place to help us operate as a business. And so we're constantly battling this usability for our end users and the system requirements from a security perspective. So in other lessons, we're going to start taking a deeper dive into how do we do these risk assessments? What do they look like? And then also how to create measurements to measure risks. And then most importantly, that this is going to turn into some sort of actionable item. Just measuring or assessing risk by itself is not something that's going to be very useful for us unless it turns into some sort of action. So we're going to talk about what action steps we're going to take once we get these measurements and once we do the risk assessment.